Yes, once again, very warm welcome and listenings from my e-lecture. Today, we are going to start a new topic, that is scope of sociolinguistics. As in our previous lecture, we talked about what is sociolinguistics and how this is different from sociology of language. Different definitions we have discussed in previous lecture as sociolinguistics. This is the study of the relationship between language and society. Today we'll see scope of sociolinguistics. When we use the word scope, what does it mean? Scope means a variety of topics or a range of topics, subject matter that we discuss in a particular subject. Every subject has certain scope. Some subjects have limited scope, some subjects have broader scope. So sociolinguistics has broader scope. Number of subject matter, number of topics are discussed under the umbrella of sociolinguistics. When we talk about the definition of sociolinguistics, from the very definition, it becomes quite clear that it studies the relationship between language and society, and it describes that how different social factors affect on language. Those social factors are something like age, and sometimes different classes as we have in our society, different groups, different families, and even gender, sex differences. So all these certain factors, there may be economic factors, social classes as we have, upper class, lower class, middle class, working class. So all these social factors affect on the very use of language. This is what that we study in sociolinguistics. Why people speak different languages in different contexts. We have to meet in real life situation in different contexts. So depending upon the changing of the context, we automatically change the selection of words, the selection of sentence structure, and sometimes even phonological variations occur in our language. How these variations occur, when these variations occur, what are certain social, economic, religious, and other factors which affect on these variations. This is all about that we study in sociolinguistics. When we talk about sociolinguistics, in sociolinguistics, language is studied on three levels. When we say sociolinguistics, it means language is studied in relation to society. So there are three levels of studying language. As you see, structural and functional, and last one is social. At structural level, we only focus on the pronunciation, phonological aspect of language and vocabulary, certain choices that we make during our conversation depending upon certain social and economic and political contexts. So one level is structural level. We only focus on phonological and vocabulary and certain tenses that is related to grammar. Functional aspects, as we see, we do not study language only under the umbrella or under the heading of grammar or certain phonological aspects. Rather, we also study language with regard to its functional aspect, because with the help of language we perform different functions. Sometimes we perform the function of order, sometimes we perform the function of giving permission to others, sometimes we accept, sometimes we reject. So these are different functions which are done with the help of language. So functional aspect of language is one of the level in which we study language. Social aspects. So language is a social behavior, right? Language is not something that can exist in isolated form. It has a deep connection, it has a profound connection with society. So language basically is social in nature. This is the language by which we can express our emotions, our desires, our feelings, and the most important messages that can be communicated with the help of language. So this is the social phenomena, social behavior that we have in our society on the basis of the utilization of language. So this is the scope of linguistics, that in sociolinguistics, structural, functional, and social aspects of languages are discussed. And as when we talk about linguistics, we have divided linguistics into micro-linguistics and macro-linguistics. As the term itself suggests, micro, limited one. Language is discussed within the context of language. One aspect of language is discussed like phonology, phonetics, syntax, semantics. So only linguistic aspect of language is discussed under micro, limited one. But when we study language at broader level, that becomes macro linguistics. So we study language in relationship with other fields of knowledge like sociolinguistics, psycholinguistics, anthropological linguistics, mathematical linguistics, computational linguistics, and many other branches are also there. In the same way, when we study the relationship of language and society, this is itself a branch of macro linguistics, but it is further divided into two approaches. There are two approaches which are involved in the study of relationship between language and society. Two approaches are micro-sociolinguistics and macro-sociolinguistics. As the term suggests, micro, it means it has limited range, right? Limited, and this has broader sense. Micro, it explains the structural patterns that exist in language of a particular society. It only focuses on the structural aspects of, and you know, in structural aspects we have phonology, sound, pronunciation, vocabulary and different tenses, grammar. These are structural aspects. So in micro-linguistics, we only focus on these aspects of the language in relation to society. There are certain subfields in micro-sociolinguistics, and there are certain subfields in micro-linguistics like phonology, phonetics. In the same way, there are certain subfields which we discuss under the umbrella of micro-sociolinguistics. And what are those subfields? Dialectology. We will be studying in detail all these aspects of language. Dialectology, the study of dialects, different varieties of language, how different varieties exist within the same language, sometime on the basis of regional differences, that is called as regional dialect. Sometimes those varieties exist on the basis of professional differences, that is known as registers. Sometimes those varieties exist on personal, individual differences. Every person has got his own individual variety of language, individual habit of speech, that is known as idiolect. Sometimes those varieties of language exist on the basis of social differences, upper class, lower class. These different classes in the society have got different variety of language. Variety of language means subfield, sub form of language. We will be discussing in detail what does it mean by dialect, but here just I'm giving you a glimpse of all these concepts. Discourse analysis, right? Any stretch of language that has unified whole, right? Cohesion, coherence. So discourse will be ethnography. In certain societies, there are certain speech communities which has got distinctive markers, which has got distinctive identifications in their society. So we will also see how, depending upon the differences in ethnicity, we have different varieties of the same language in the same society. Geolinguistics, how geographical changes affect on the use of language and how different varieties come into existence just because of their geographical changes. Language context, secular linguistics and social psychology of language. These are subfields which are discussed under micro-sociolinguistics. It has limited scope and it has a broader scope. How it has broader scope? Here we only focus on the structural patterns, but here you see sociology. This is also called as sociology of language. As in previous lecture we have also discussed that in sociology of language it is a bit different from sociolinguistics. How? Because in this sociology of language, the object of study, the focus of the study is society. See how rise and fall of particular languages in a society occur. So there are certain social factors, political factors, religious factors, and many other factors which are involved in the rise and fall of language. Sometimes language enjoys the higher status, and sometimes different dialects or varieties that exist within the same language, those some few dialects enjoy higher status and few dialects enjoy less status. So how language or certain varieties of language suffer from rise or fall. This is the subject of study of macro sociolinguistics and distribution of language varieties across various groups. How different varieties exist in different social groups, in different various groups. And what are those various groups? There are certain social groups, economic groups, gender, right? As you see in social groups, language, depending upon the variation in different social groups, we have different languages. In the same way, economic, upper class, lower class, middle class. So depending upon these social classes, these social groups affect on the utilization of language. Gender, male's language is different from female's language, sometime on the basis of topics and sometime on the basis of certain structures. If you analyze, although there are some linguists and certain feminists who disagree with this point, that there is no gender discrimination in language, but the dominant view is that there are differences in the use of language depending upon the gender differences. As you know, gender is a social difference. Sometimes we have certain expectations on males and certain different expectations on females. So depending upon the expectations, depending upon the roles of males and females in society, these two genders are different in terms of their use of language. For example, there are certain taboos, forbidden words. Mostly these taboos are used in the form of language by males, and females avoid by using taboos. And there are many other differences in the use of male and female's language that we will discuss in later classes. Families differences, families discriminations also affect, and friendship. Sometime when we are in the company of our intimate friends, we of course automatically will select informal words. There is an informal use of language. So these are subfields. There are certain subfields of macro sociolinguistics. We study language variation and language change, how historically, how chronically, how with the passage of time different languages become the subject of change, how different variations occur. Here we don't focus on the variations, we only focus on the structural patterns. What are the patterns which we have after the changing, but how those changes occur, this is the subject of macro sociolinguistics. What are the social, political, economic factors which are involved in the language variation and change? Pidgin, that is the subject of macro sociolinguistics. Sometimes we don't have any common language, and for the sake of trade we have to communicate with each other, so we develop a kind of language, right, which is not full-fledged language, we can say. So we will discuss in detail. For trade purpose we have to use a certain language, and how that pidgin becomes the native language. Pidgin doesn't have any native speaker, but later on it gets maturity and it becomes the native language, mother language of our next generation, that is known as the process of creolization, Creole language, and how we have different language attitudes in different societies. So these are subfields of macro sociolinguistics. So this is